Today on the Perception in Action podcast, can athletes learn to use the auditory information available in a sports environment to improve their performance? Can we see all around us with sound? An interview with Brian Bushway and Tom Izdebski from Acoustic Athletics. So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Before we get to today's topic, I want to tell you about my new book. Yes, I've written a new book on skill acquisition called How We Learn to Move, a revolution in the way we coach and practice sports skills. It covers the ecological approach to skill from different angles, including practice design, the CLA, coaching, youth sports, designing technology, injury prevention, and using analytics. So I hope you will consider giving it a read. You can find the book on Amazon or by going to perceptionaction.com/book. Now on to the show. In today's episode, I had a really fascinating discussion with Tom and Brian from Acoustic Athletics. For those that aren't familiar with his story, Brian started to go blind when he was 14 and now has no response to light at all. But amazingly, he can still see. Brian has learned to echolocate. That is, he uses the auditory information that naturally occurs in our environment, the sounds bouncing around off objects, to localize and identify objects and events. He uses this to mountain bike, ice skate, and perform a host of other activities. If you're interested in seeing him in action, I've included links to videos in the show notes. Now, with the help of Tom, he's trying to teach athletes to do this, both those that are visually impaired like himself and normally sighted athletes. Think about it. Imagine you're a soccer midfielder waiting to receive a pass, and instead of having to turn your head all around to see what's there, you can just hear where the other players are. Sounds impossible, but let's hear more about how it can be done. It's my pleasure today to be joined by Brian and Tom from Acoustic Athletics. We'll talk a little bit about really their fascinating company they've developed and the kind of the training things. But I wanted to start by just giving them both a chance to kind of introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their background, and we'll get into to Brian's a bit more because obviously that's how the company was built. So maybe we'll start with you, Tom. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got involved in this?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Tom Izdebski. Thanks for having us on the podcast this morning on the show. You know, I was kind of waiting for the music to start before you started talking. You know?
That's coming later.
Strange, but you know, as soon as you started talking, all right, I'm ready to go.
Okay.
You know, so a little bit about my background. Let's see. I went to ASU for both undergrad and grad school studying biochemistry. I met Brian while I was at ASU. I went to visit a friend of mine that I went to high school with who attended Pepperdine University. And Brian and him were roommates at the time. And so the three of us had a great time, you know, and it turns out, you know, about 20 years later, we're still friends. So that's pretty fantastic. That doesn't happen too often. Mm-hmm. But, you know, along the way, Brian and I have talked extensively about, you know, his vision loss, his learning of echolocation, and how it's impacted his life in a positive way. So this has really like impacted me, seeing how it's changed his life. And so, you know, really for the last several years, I've done kind of whatever I could in various capacities to help advance his cause as far as you know, teaching the blind community around the world about echolocation, and then raising societal awareness about the abilities of visually impaired and blind individuals. You know, so that's how Brian and I have kind of been linked together for a substantial amount of time. And, you know, most recently, probably in the last year, 18 months or so, I would say, actually going on 2 years now, the discussions have started really to shift away from the visually impaired community and more specifically towards the sighted community and the professional athletes and, you know, really top performers in the sighted community, because, you know, outside of athletics, we're also in discussions with some military groups and first responders as well. But so that's kind of how Acoustic Athletics came about. We realized that there was a lot of skills and abilities that Brian had that we thought were transferable to sighted individuals, and we selected those groups because they're generally highly motivated groups that have to go through lots of training, and so we thought that those would be really good groups to work with.
Yeah. No, that's really fascinating stuff. And I'm interested to hear more about like kind of the specifics of what you guys are doing. But we'll turn to Brian. I'll link to some of the, I watched some of the YouTube videos about your story, and I'll link to some of those. And, probably the incorrect choice of words, but you have to see it to believe it, some of the stuff that's happened. But can you tell us a little bit about your background, Brian, and kind of what led you to Acoustic Athletics?
Yeah, I mean, Acoustic Athletics we help people develop their perceptual system in basics. And this is what I had to learn firsthand as a 14-year-old. At the end of 7th grade, I started noticing I couldn't read the classroom board anymore. And by the beginning of 8th grade, over that summer vacation of 4 to, let's say, 6 months, I went from being totally functional with vision, ocular vision, using patterns of light to see. And I went from functionally using that to then having no light perception.
Okay.
And found myself out of school, lost in my own house, and then having to figure out how to re-enter and navigate the world. And they say, if you lose one sense, your other senses get stronger. And it turns out that that's actually pretty true, but we don't really have understood why that is. And what was really going on, this has everything to do with neuroplasticity. And I started firsthand experiencing how adaptable the brain could be very quickly. So there I was in my 8th grade, 14, trying to figure out, thrown into an identity crisis, having to figure out, be brave and just pick up the white cane and start navigating the high school hallways. And there it was, a pillar, open space, a pillar. Wait a second. I thought I was seeing things. Like there was physically an object in front versus nothing. I could walk around these things, but I'm told I have no light perception by the doctors. Okay. So, and then I closed my eyes and they were still there. I could walk around these columns. And I shared this phenomenon of experience with some of my other, teachers of the visually impaired. And they just said, oh yeah, other people that talk about their senses getting stronger, and no one could actually put what I was experiencing into context. And then it ended up meeting a mentor, and I shared this experience of how I could tell that there were pillars and move around them and interact with these objects. And he goes, Brian, what you're using is echolocation. You're hearing sound reflect off of objects, and the brain is able to image with sound.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And that's when it clicked.
Yeah.
That's when it made sense. Like now I have real context and go, oh, that's how I'm doing it. That's why when I'm walking down a narrow hallway, I can hear the external edge and then the open space of the intersecting hallway. And then after I understood it, my brain was like, this is important stuff. Start paying attention. And then now I just assign meaning to the subtleties of this information. And then the rest was up to my human motivation to start transforming my brain.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. So just so people know, you're not just feeling things with a cane, and you're not just getting crude, oh, there's one big thing in front of me. In the video you can see you can recognize types of objects. You mountain bike and skate, and so it's not just roughly navigating around the environment. You're able to do incredible actions through getting this sound information from the environment, these reflections and, off the objects in the environment. It's just like, echolocation. I think most people will think of a bat, right? It's exactly what they're doing, right? They're creating these sound information from the sound. It's really quite remarkable. I think your point you made too, also, so in some of the videos I saw, you had your hearing is not any better than anyone else, right? If you just gave you a hearing test, it's not like you can hear lower volumes or anything. It's just you are tuned into different information about sound than most people are, right?
Yeah. There's two parts. There's one, my ears are, that's normal for whatever my age is.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's two things. There's the mental focus of just learning what information is important to pay attention to, because we all have filters and sort of decide what's going to be relevant to us or not. So there is the focus part of it. And then there's the actual part of the brain changing. Like my brain has redeployed part of its like wiring to use this auditory information in more specific ways. Like some of the MRI scans that they did in the early days up in actually London, Ontario, Canada, was some of the first places we did it. And what they found there is that, yes, in fact, that my brain and other people's brains, your brain, every human's brain can take auditory information and it sends it specifically into the object recognition parts of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a world of fuzzy geometry. There's layers of sound. So blindness is really a bad term, because when we think blind, we think nothing.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, an active echolocator has enough like acuity to see what a 20/20 person does with their peripheral vision.
Mm-hmm.
So what you see in your peripheral vision is sort of equal to what an active echolocator is perceiving.
They can perceive.
That's a lot of information. That's a lot more than nothing. But then sound has its own advantages. That sound travels in 360 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
Sound vibrates things, so you can tell density of objects with sound. So it's pretty remarkable. Like light and sound both work in the same principle, that they reflect off of objects.
Mm-hmm.
And so the brain is so clever. Like every person was born with this ability. Our brain images whether we send it patterns of light or whether we send it patterns of sound. And I was just fortunate enough to get exposed to this at like an early on. And it was like, well, dude, the more information I have, the more capable of person I am. Why would I not want more information? Why would I not want to do this?
Yeah.
So it just made me a more competent person. Like if we're not free to move through our physical space, it really inhibits the rest of how we're going to socially interact and just, make it through life.
Yeah, you're right. We are such visually dominated creatures, right? When you take that, one of the things I teach sensation and perception, I always ask, if you had to lose one sense, what would it be? And not many people will pick vision, right? We're so visually dominant. But you're right, the thinking about object perception doesn't have to be inherently visual, right? It's not. So the other really interesting aspect of what you do, I think, is really, I love, because of, one of my heroes in psychology, James Gibson, always talked about, you perceive to act, but you also act to perceive. And a large part of what you do is not just the sensitivity to this acoustic information, is you actively create sounds, right? By clicking and doing things to give yourself information from the environment. You're not just passively moving through it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, that's where, when I first discovered echolocation, I was passively doing it. So there's sort of two types. There's active echolocation and passive echolocation.
Mm-hmm.
And at first, it was the ambient noises, the cars running by in the distance, people talking in the distance, whatever sound was already making noise was subtly reflecting off the pillars and the walls, giving contrast to open space and more closed in and solid walls and, sparse bushes. I didn't have the vocabulary yet to talk about all those things, but I was at some level subtly aware, and that was all being done passively.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then my mentor said, Brian, why don't you use an active sonar signal? Use a tongue click or hand clap or a cane tap, anything. Does a couple things. When you're actively clicking, it postures the whole perceptual system to go, ha, okay, I'm engaged. What am I trying to be aware of?
Mm-hmm.
And then also the active signal, the brain learns to listen to that unique sound. And the tongue click actually is superior for many reasons.
Mm-hmm.
It can be made very quiet or very loud. And that's for focus, because small objects get camouflaged by the larger ones behind them.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're strategically looking, if you know you're looking for something small up against the wall, you're going to want to use a quieter active signal, because the larger things are you're just going to hear those more. So you can be strategic in the volume of your click. The click also carries high frequencies. It carries low frequencies. So it's a pretty good sound source.
Mm-hmm.
And also it's located in between the ears. So it's great for sound localization. A person can be very exact.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that they found in those early studies in Canada, was they put at 3 feet away in an anechoic chamber. They put a pole, and you can, it's sort of concave. Picture like a pool noodle cut in half. They lined it with a bunch of tin foil to help make it a little bit more reflective. They stick it on a pole, and they had it at, straight ahead at called 0. And then they would move it 1 or 2 degrees to the left, 1 or 2 degrees to the right. And then we would have to tell, could we tell the difference of how far off of center it was?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it was remarkable that the human ear was accurate within like a couple inches, inch and a half, couple inches. Like the human eye is only so good too to tell. But they had never done studies before to know if the ear could actually be that accurate. They had a lot of theories, but it was only, 20-ish years ago that we finally decided to study how accurate the ear can be. Wow, we've taken a lot for granted of what we think we know about the human senses. There's a lot of theories, but maybe not a lot of actual real understanding. And so that's the power of the active sonar signal, is you get that much more clarity in your acoustic images. Mm-hmm. Another analogy would be like, most people, they have central vision and peripheral vision. Mm-hmm. Most people use their central vision for details, reading things. And then we're using our peripheral vision for movement, night, and things on our side. Well, an active sonar, tongue click, that would be like a person's central vision. You want more detail? Use an active signal. If you're sort of okay, then use passive, like one's peripheral vision. So just because one is using an active signal or not, everybody is constantly echolocating, passively or actively. Mm-hmm. Like I'm always imaging my environment acoustically. I cannot turn it off.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. Yeah. And for those that don't know, you've referenced a couple of times, you participated in a bunch of studies with Mel Goodale, right, at Western University in Canada, one of the world's leading neuroscientists. His resume goes without speaking. So, yeah, no, that's really fascinating. Do you use your head movement a lot to kind of change the sound you get?
Yeah. So part of the technique is to do head scanning from left to right, because that's going to help draw out like edges. Right. We get a sense of depth because it's all about edge detection. Mm-hmm. So sound works in layers in that same way. And so, yeah, you could be scanning up and down if one wants. You could be left and right. But head movement, it's going to give you contrast, right? The human eye is constantly moving around all the time too. But people just seem to think that the brain is compensating and making like, a still sort of image, even though it's, dynamic and all over the place. Mm-hmm. So we're sort of, right. So representing a lot of the same things that the human eye does, just very quickly, right? The human, like vision, it's a distant sense,
right?
Gathers lots of information far away very quickly. Well, if you don't have patterns of light, the next best sense for distance would be hearing. Yeah.
You know, and depending on what it is that you're trying to understand, like what stimulus or what type of input, for example, you know, audition has a higher level of temporal resolution than your other senses. You know, when it comes to issues of timing, you know, it's the ear.
Yeah,
it's the ear
for sure.
I mean, yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah,
I mean, that's why we're seeing it. And that's where a lot of our work, you know, comes in with acoustic athletics, is exactly what Tom was talking about. People want to get better and more in tune with what they're hearing and how they're moving, because it really helps create more of a spatial understanding. Right.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. You know, I teach kind of echolocation a bit in one of my classes, and you talk about, you know, interoral time differences for sounds coming from your left, and you say there's a difference, but you measure it, it's a fraction of a second, right? Our auditory system is super sensitive. That's how we recognize speech too, right? We're super sensitive to timing differences in hearing, way more than vision. So I think that's a great point, right? So maybe we'll move on to kind of acoustic athletics, Tom. So you kind of had this goal of trying to develop this ability more in athletics, and initially you were started with you know, people that were blind, visual impairment, that wanted to participate in sports, but you've also extended it to non-impaired, or whatever category we want to put. So can you talk a little bit about how that came about?
Yeah, you know, so going back to the early days of college, you know, my neighbor studied kinesiology at ASU, and he was also studying, and he continued studying for several years at Z Health. I don't know if you're familiar with that group, kind of just down the road from ASU. Fantastic organization. They've got some great curriculum. And so already, you know, this is 20 years ago. I'm in my neighbor's room, and I'm doing blindfolded curls. And he's telling me about proprioception, you know. And so then I go back to, you know, Mel Siff in the book Super Training, where they talk about blindfolded training and its impact on proprioception. You know, starting to put these ideas together, you know, the ability to understand this 360-degree landscape around you through sound, this idea that taking vision away could improve your proprioception, could have a positive impact on your balance if trained appropriately. As I started to put some of these ideas together, I saw that, wow, we have some really unique training programs for elite athletes. You know, you probably know this as well as anybody who works with professional athletes. There's some areas in their skill set where there's just gaping holes. You know, they're missing very, very fundamental control of certain aspects of their abilities. You know, a good example, you know, in mid-June, I was watching a UFC fight, and Joe Rogan was commenting on the title fight between Israel Adesanya and Martin Vettori. And in the first round, Joe Rogan mentioned, and Israel Adesanya, he was defending his championship belt. He's been a champion for, you know, some number of years, and before he came to the UFC, he was also a champion. So here's a guy who athletically is at the top of his sport, on top of the world. And Joe Rogan says during the first round, you know, for the first time in his career, Izzy is doing breathing exercises. He's not breathing because he's exercising, but he's specifically doing breathing exercises. And he says, and you can see it in his game. And so, you know, that goes to what I was saying, that there's some fundamental things that I think we could work on with athletes to really improve their game tremendously. And when I start to think about taking away vision, right, there's these aspects of balance, proprioception, but then there's the whole echolocation aspect of things, understanding things spatially, but then there's still another level, then there's still just a whole greater appreciation and understanding of the sounds, the sounds of the game and the information that comes from all of that, because there's a tremendous amount of information. When you think about, in baseball, the sound of the ball coming off the bat tells the outfielders a lot of information. Do they have to run backwards or forwards to catch that ball? Which direction should they be running in? That they, as I started reading more about this, I see that there's a statistic now they started calculating called jump. And part of that is reaction to the sound.
And that's something that Mookie on the Dodgers just started practicing. His back turned to home plate, running, waiting, hitting, listening to the ball come off the bat. And they used to do this a lot in the 70s. And then this whole thing sort of was lost for a while. And then Mookie started repracticing this, because it takes a lot of time to then have to look over one shoulder, right? We're talking matters of seconds. So if you can rely on your other senses and be that confident, you're going to save a lot of cognitive load and processing. How do you strategically orient your senses to be best used in the moment? Like, a lot of times you can do these things without needing to actually visually see, because there's all these other muscle memory, all these other sounds in the soundscape really informing what's going on. And so, like, we're seeing this done, and we started doing all this other research and looking, wow, every sport is doing blindfold exercises, but most of the time they're doing it from a communication standpoint and not a perceptual development. How do you actually get your brain to change to actually use this information in more profound ways? And so that's part of what we've been designing is because all of the work I've done with the visually impaired population, right? We're getting them in the adaptive sports to do kids missing half their brain with one leg and no eyes, having huge gains, doing things no one thought was possible. If they can do it and their brains can change, wow, professional athletes, if they're stuck in their plateau, some of this curriculum training can help them break out of that, and they're going to do things they never thought were possible. So then a couple things are happening. It's going to change their psycho-emotional status, but they're actually learning new skill sets. They're actually hearing the world differently. Like a huge application, like I myself, I used to play hockey, recreationally, but I can still get on ice skates and I can skate backwards, full speed and stop before hitting the dashboards backwards.
Wow.
I don't even look over.
That's amazing.
Past the wall, right? Like, I'm already aware of it. Like, so imagine that applied to every sports team. And we've been doing some work with some of the junior and talking with some of the hockey coaches in the junior leagues coming up. And everyone is that hockey, that hockey sense, right? There's in all these sports, there's a sort of this voodoo awareness, like, oh, some people are so great that they have this extrasensory ability to read the game. Well, when you start asking those players who say they have it, you start realizing they're just using their other senses and their awareness at a more nuanced level. Like the world is full of information. It's up for us to decide how we, pull out from it or just define relevance to it to make our brains go, aha, let me pay attention to that next time. That could be useful.
Yeah. No, I love that. I love that phrase, the world is full of information. Yeah. The ones that immediately come to mind to me, like in hockey, if you're a defenseman, you have to go and get the puck in the corner. What's going on behind you. A soccer midfielder, you're receiving the ball. All this stuff's going on behind you.
Well, that you soccer, could, even more so in soccer. Think about like a penalty kick. The goalkeeper can't see the ball for the first portion of that penalty kick, and he has to rely on the auditory information that he's getting.
Yeah, and I like your point too about you're right, we have this kind of mysterious thing about great athletes have this awareness of around them. But if you measure things like peripheral vision, there's no real difference in skill level, right? It's not that they see wider or see, it's something else. And I think you're on to,
They integrate the inputs a little better.
Yeah.
That's what it is. I think at least, right, that they're able to finely tune. They're aware of these inputs slightly more than others, and they're able to process them and do effective things with those inputs.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. So can you talk a little bit about how you train people to so you mentioned, I think the first part of it, like occluding and forcing people to use it a bit more, but do you also kind of design like different stimuli for them to practice and to get used to it? I'm sure there's also the active echolocation part coming in at some point. So can you talk a little bit about how you develop this skill in athletes?
Yeah. Well, the first thing we know with like neuroplasticity, if you want your brain to be like, in like a hyper state ready to learn, you got to change the environment. Mm-hmm. Put a human in a new environment. Whoa, we're all challenged. Nobody, like, we're all uncomfortable, but that's the whole point. The whole point is how quickly can anybody become familiar with the unknown, right? That's why we love it. Home court advantage. Why? We inherently have embedded these terms in this understanding. So, dude, it doesn't have to be an advantage if you're the opponent team and you're coming. Well, why don't you do your best to make that arena feel like home for yourself? Mm-hmm. Right? So this is where we're pulling from all of this work, because if you're like a visually impaired or blind traveler, the trick is how quickly can you familiarize yourself with a new environment? Mm-hmm. A big park, a room, a house, an office building. That's it. Most visually impaired people, when they're in their comfortable place, they're familiar, everybody forgets that they're visually impaired because everything is sort of set up. So the whole point about life is when the route and the plan doesn't go according to plan, what do we do? Mm-hmm. And so these are skills about facing the unknown at the larger level. So the part of different sports require different sort of techniques and stimuli and training protocols, because everyone's trying to get something a little bit different. But in general, the quickest way to change one's environment and put their brain in a hyper sort of state is to put a blindfold on them. Mm-hmm. Because you take away one's dominant sense, now they're challenged to do simple things that they took for granted. Mm-hmm. And then once one starts sort of rethinking about, maybe my sense of touch is better to figure that out. I never knew that, like, there was a slight gradient on the ground, a level change. And so vision is a loud sense. It occupies like 2/3 of the brain. Mm-hmm. It's so when you quiet that sense, wow, there's so much more room and opportunity for the brain to have to consider other things. Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of what we're taking is we take these perceptual principles and then we create individual sort of curriculum for the sport, for the specific teams and the needs and the person.
Okay. That's great. Yeah. So you're teaching them kind of to pick up the features that might be particular for a sport. It's sport specific kind of aspects to it.
Yeah. I mean, at that level, when we're talking at that level, it's very sports specific, but like the average person who wants to learn this too, like yourself, we would, we would take kind of a slightly, different approach.
I don't know if Rob's average. Come on.
Thanks. In this regard, for sure. I always.
We're certainly interested in coming to you and having this discussion because, you research this type of stuff. Realistically, we may not even understand all of the best scenarios and ways to set this up. What we do know is several things like. But before I even say what we do know, I just wanted to mention also, David Eagleman and the defensive brain activation theory. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you're familiar with that. That's work he came out with recently in Time magazine. However, he published it December 30th, 2020.
Okay.
final issue of Time magazine. and the title of his article there was "Why Do We Dream?"
Mm-hmm.
And he says essentially, well, he started with a few paragraphs about a child who lost his vision, around age 12, very much like Brian, learned to echolocate. And so he starts writing about the wonders of the human brain and the wonders of neuroplasticity, how this can happen in an individual who loses his vision. Then he discussed a few experiments that were done where they've took sighted individuals through some kind of blindfolded training and looked at changes in their brains. And, he says that our brains are so neuroplastic, they change so quickly. He says we dream at night to preserve the visual cortex, to preserve the integrity of the visual cortex.
Mm-hmm. Wow. That sounds interesting stuff. I'm not familiar with that one there.
Yeah, I mean, very interesting. And so, also thinking about taking away vision and then forcing somebody to move, I thought is an interesting way to kind of like hack into the brain, because while you're dreaming and seeing all these pictures, you're also paralyzed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a really interesting take on it. Yeah. And I think I did an episode a couple of years ago, a podcast where I looked at the research on blind training. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of mixed because I think unlike what you guys are doing, it's not very purposeful or structured. It's just, let's put a blindfold on, you try to do your sport.
The intention is so key. The intention, the understanding, this higher level of conversation. Without that, I mean, you can see thousands of people doing blindfolded stuff and they're kind of like, I saw that one of the Premier League teams got a new soccer coach February 2020. And he had the whole team put on blindfolds, and the exercise that he had them do was called blindfolded chicken. Mm-hmm. No, crazy chicken. It was called crazy chicken. Even better. No, it was called crazy chicken.
Yeah.
And you're watching this, you're like, I read what Mel Siff has to say about, training and executing movements under blindfold and what that does for proprioception, et cetera, et cetera. What they're doing there is none of that. That's I'm not even sure what they were doing.
Yeah.
Well, I take a look at this. I'm like, wait a second. I go in there. We can make this modification, change this. Guys, listen to these sounds. You have this ability to hear. It doesn't have to be crazy. And here's the point. We were talking with Greg Downey, an anthropologist in Australia, and he shared with us in the last month or two that the Aborigines in Australia for professional football, they're overrepresented in the sport.
Oh, really?
There's more of them playing professionally. And they went and did studies and were like, why? Why is the Aborigines more represented than the Western people? Is because the Western people played under street light. They played under artificial lighting conditions, where the Aborigines played in the dark. Mm-hmm. They didn't have lights.
Yeah.
And so they developed this whole other relationship with sound in the sport.
It's more like the differential learning, right? Where you're doing it like out in the dark, maybe by the moonlight on a uneven field, versus doing practice in some kind of air conditioned arena.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that goes to show wow, now we have this one team over here doing the crazy chicken drill, but then you have this other culture who it's just embedded in their skill set. And so part of what we're doing is bringing this conversation, connecting the dots and being, hello, human race, let's pay attention to this. We all could be a little bit better here.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you make the great points. And I think the difference, it's got to be purposeful and it's going to take some time, right? You can't just do one session with a blindfold and expect, I think, I imagine, was it for you, I imagine when it first happened, it would be all loud, someone blasting, a loud sound. You have to learn to differentiate the sounds, and right, if you just blindfold you're not gonna. You have to learn to pick out the patterns and things. So it'd just be loud noise at first, I would think. Yeah.
I mean, putting blindfold on people with 20/20 vision is actually a very complicated thing to do from a psychological, emotional standpoint. So anytime we do this, you just can't put someone under blindfold because all they experience is what they're missing.
Mm-hmm.
So you actually have to prime them to go, hey, when you do, you actually have to like help them know there's information in this environment. There's things that you ground to, because as humans, if we don't feel physically grounded, we're anxious.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So there's actually a part of our physical need to feel like we're connected to our world, to the walls, to the space. Like there's comfort knowing that we're not going to take the next step and fall off into a cliff.
Mm-hmm.
Like we need this physical grounding. So you put a blindfold on people and they immediately like are anxious, like
mm-hmm.
what's going on? And all of their like past traumas start like coming up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting watching people's, it's really more psychological when you put a blindfold on a person, watching their psychological insecurities get played out before you even get to moving.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like a certain sense of like, all right, you're going to put this on. Don't worry about what you're missing. The intention is what else is here that you can use. And then and you help guide people into picking a few of those concrete things in the environment, now they feel like they can start being more free and move around because you're not getting lost. You're like, oh, sound triangulates in corners. Echoes are awesome in corners.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because
and then you take that, like, then the next level of that, would be acoustic references in sport, the sounds from sport.
Mm-hmm.
That you can hear either your sounds or the opponent's sounds or sounds of the game that add additional acoustic information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and you just sort of, and the trick is to integrate all of this layers of information. So it's assigning importance to it, getting people to sort of have some experiences with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other part is now we have to sort of deconstruct our filters. Why is it that we aren't already paying attention to this? The echo information that I access, it's there in your room. It's there for all of us to access anytime we want. Most of us just do not.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting, we did kind of get cap vision kind of takes over everything. I imagine you just kind of have to learn to not shut it off, but you're right. I think you put it together, like see with these other sources of information. That's really interesting. Do you also teach, in athletes, the active location, active part? Like I can imagine hockey, hitting your stick on the ice, I guess that's a little bit harder in sports because like clicking and stuff with a bit louder environment. But is there a component of training the active echolocation?
Yeah, we're working with so there's different ways of making active signals, right? The hockey, tapping the hockey stick is similar to like a cane tap, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's still working. There's ambient noise and passive, but yes. So we're working with Brandon Shin, and he's going professional in jiu-jitsu, but he also does like mixed martial arts, and he's totally blind. And because he has a mouthpiece, instead of clicking, he uses a shh, shh, shh. So while he's using his breathing exercises, he's exhaling, creating an active signal.
Oh, wow.
And that's giving him enough information of knowing where a focus mitt is or an opponent. Like he, the other day, like dodged a roundhouse kick because he heard shh, and the leg come up just in the nick of time and was able to, block it and move out of the way.
Yeah.
So we incorporate it when possible. But here's the deal. Most people start paying attention to the click in their head, or they're listening to the sound come out of their mouth.
Right.
You don't want to do that. You actually want, you're really trying to put your intention and focus to that echo.
Right.
That's reflecting at the speed of sound wherever's around you. So that's where the mental focus and energy comes into helping people train. Like, don't just listen to what's happening inside you. That's less important than what's out there.
Picking up No, that makes a lot of sense. You're right. I think I could imagine doing that myself. Yeah, this is really fascinating stuff. Brings up a lot of thoughts. Athletes are it seems like they're willing to try anything, right? Almost to get the 1% gain sometimes. This seems like a no-brainer, the way more than 1% gain.
Right.
Like it's a no-brainer thing. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Once you start to have awareness about the auditory input and the importance of it, you realize a couple of things that signals process a little quicker. Auditory signals process a little quicker than visual signals in the brain, by maybe 50 milliseconds faster. So you're able to get the information in there a little faster. For things like timing, you're able to resolve timing things a little better with your ears than your eyes, for example. But then you start to get into things, like I mentioned, acoustic reafferences, whether it's a tennis player serving, whether it's the ping pong player initiating his movement upon hearing the opponent hit the ball rather than seeing the paddle or seeing the ball. He starts his movement when he hears the sound of the hit on the other side. There's the acoustic references, like I mentioned, and then there's the whole side of like rhythmic auditory stimulation in Parkinson's patients. And because rhythm has this temporal feature, the auditory sense is a very unique channel for us to access the brain and hardwire some things in there.
Yeah, no, I can see that. And that's another, rhythm is another, I think is a really interesting aspect of it that we're way better at in auditory sense than vision. And yeah, that's really cool stuff.
And almost every complex sport movement is rhythmic, whether it's breathing, running to first base, swinging the bat, it's all rhythm.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know, one of the things I kind of been interested in lately too is I know people are trying to use like sonification as a tool to help people learn movements. Creating a sound from your movement, but artificially, I think is a really interesting new avenue too.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So, well, this is really fascinating stuff, guys. So can just kind of to end off, can you tell us, if people are interested in this, where to go and how to find out more about what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. You can visit our website, www.acousticathletics.com. That's probably the easiest way to get a hold of us.
Yeah.
Just go to the website. Absolutely.
And Brian, I think you have a website too, right? That tells a bit more about your story and some of the studies you've been involved in.
It's brianbushway.com and acousticsathletics.com, but brianbushway.com will take you what you want to know.
Okay.
Well, we're working to put up more of our like social media, update our website. We're a small operation. You've got our whole team on the line right now. So that's the secretary, the accountant, the lawyer. You've got everybody, the graphic designer, the internet guy, and there's only three of us.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's a fascinating thing. And like Brian said, it's out there. All this information is out there just waiting for you to pick up, right? It's there. It's your choice whether you don't really need to do anything extra. It's just waiting for you to tune into.
And that's been part of the trick for me as a teacher too, right?
Yeah.
Like it's part of how do we make all of this science actually accessible to people? And I mean, accessible, like how do we bring this into the human practice on the day-to-day? This stuff can enhance all of our lives. These principles that we see the athletes taking advantage of are the things that these people who've been the most marginalized, the visually impaired people. I've spent most of my work traveling overseas in third world countries, Calcutta, India, then Thailand, Croatia, Armenia, all over Europe, teaching people who really are on the outsides of life, right? And all of this human perception stuff that we're talking about, they're the ones who really benefit from, but it's not being necessarily taught to them. And so part of this whole thing is just creating this bigger classroom of all this information so that we all could benefit and sort of raise expectations for what we all are capable of doing. And it will increase the quality of all of our lives. For sure.
Yeah, no, that's really great. Yeah, and I love that you're doing, you have both training athletes and all these, helping out people as well. I think that's really, really great. So,
we chose athletes because again, all of society is looking at athletes. And so if we can have athletes doing this, it raises the entire human condition for everybody instantly. We don't have to work to try to push this through the blindness organizations, down through the teachers, down to ultimately the blind students. We can start it at the top and have it work its way all the way down through the culture as the expectations get raised.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great way to do it. So, Brian and Tom, thanks very much for joining me today. That's fascinating stuff. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled. Gone straight away.